SBO is the best.
Okay, in this video, whenever we talk about altitude and heat, you want to look at it from the perspective of performance, cardiovascular drift, and acclimatization. Those are the three things we're going to zoom in on today. So we're going to ask, why does endurance performance drop at altitude? And we're going to talk about why it does. We're going to answer, why does heart rate drift upwards when you exercise in heat, even though the pace and the intensity of exercise stays the same, and that is known as cardiovascular drift. And we're going to ask ourselves, what is acclimatization and why does the timing of arrival matter? I'm going to answer that question as well in this video. So again, quick recap. If you didn't watch the previous video where we talked about altitude, we defined altitude as any elevation that is 2,400 meters and above sea level. And what changes at altitude? When you start going up higher and higher into higher altitudes, what your body experiences is that the percentage of oxygen in the air stays the same, but the air pressure drops. Therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen drops. This means even when you're at altitude, you can be breathing in the same amount of air, but the actual amount and partial pressure of oxygen in that air drops, and this makes it harder for oxygen to be delivered in the muscles. So we can describe that as reduced arterial partial pressure, which leads to lower muscle oxygen delivery. Okay, so these are the acute responses, the sort of short-term immediate responses that your body has once you start exercising at altitude. So you go up to altitude and your body's like, oh, there's not enough oxygen in the air, so we need to work harder to be able to get the oxygen into the body more and quicker. And so it does that by increasing ventilation, so you breathe more, your tidal volume goes up, breathing frequency goes up. And this is because chemoreceptors in your body detect low oxygen levels and drive your breathing up. And also what happens is your heart rate increases, so your heart beats faster to be able to maintain oxygen delivery to the working muscles. So what do these effects mean for performance? So for performance, especially for endurance and high intensity efforts, this means you're likely to fatigue earlier, especially if you haven't acclimatized to the altitude yet, because you reach a point where oxygen supply can't keep up with your body's demand for oxygen. And so that reduces your aerobic contribution and it forces your body to be able to create energy anaerobically. All right, we've spoken about what happens in the immediate short term when you haven't acclimatized yet, but this is what happens when you do acclimatize. So we've mentioned acclimatize once or twice in this video. Acclimatization basically means when your body adapts to the requirements of altitude. So this is when you've been training at altitude for quite some time, a few weeks, and your body is starting to gradually adjust to the low oxygen availability to be able to increase oxygen delivery and to reduce the strain that altitude is having on you. So this is what happens when you start to acclimatize. You experience an increase in red blood cell production. This is a process known as, let me just write this down here. There's a process known as erythropoiesis. Let me spell that properly. Erythropoiesis. This is where you create more red blood cells, which obviously increases oxygen carrying capacity. Next adaptation is an increased ventilation over time. So with prolonged altitude exposure, your breathing rate will remain elevated and becomes more effective at improving the amounts of oxygen that are in your arteries, basically. Next, we have increased capillarization, which would obviously help to increase the capacity and effectiveness of gaseous exchange to be able to get more oxygen into the bloodstream. And we also have increased myoglobin stores. So myoglobin stores are where oxygen is stored in muscles. So if myoglobin stores increase, then that means the level of oxygen you can store in your muscles increase, which provides a greater oxygen supply for your muscles to be able to work. it's important to be familiar to what we mean by arrival. So arrival is basically when, relative to a competition, an athlete should arrive to altitude and start training at altitude. So if you have a competition in a few days away, then arrival is the concept of whether you should arrive closer to the competition and train at altitude, or you should train at altitude a lot earlier ahead of the competition. And so there are two ways of doing this. You can either arrive early, which obviously leads to better adaptation because it's recommended to arrive around 14 days before your competition at altitude and train for at least 14 days so that you can get those acclimatization benefits. But if you can't do that, then short-term strategy is to arrive late. So you experience less adaptation, but sometimes you have to do that when time is limited. And in the case of arriving late, it could be one day before the competition or a few hours before the competition, getting to altitude and training. So there won't be as much time to acclimatize, but sometimes time is limited and athletes may choose that option. All right, that's it for altitude. Now let's talk about heat. Exercising in heat. When we exercise in heat, the body is trying to regulate your temperature. And this is called thermal regulation. These are some two ways that the body can regulate temperature. It can do it through vasodilation, which allows for heat to escape via radiation or via convection. So vasodilation here is basically when the blood vessels at the surface of the skin, close to the surface of the skin, expand and bring more blood flow to the skin to be able to allow the heat to sort of leave through the skin. And sweating is very straightforward. When your body releases fluid to allow evaporation so that the heat can also be escaped from the skin and to be able to cool your body down. All right, now let's talk about the effects of heat on the cardiovascular system. These are short-term, immediate effects. What happens when you just start exercising in heat? So what happens is more blood is sent to the skin for heat loss. Sweat loss reduces plasma volume, making blood more thick. And this thickness can be described as viscous. So you can say fluid being loosed from the plasma volume makes blood more viscous. So it reduces plasma volume and it reduces blood volume because of that. We also have venous return, which drops, which means there is less blood returning to the heart, and also stroke volume drops as well, and heart rate rises to be able to maintain cardiac output. And it gets to a point where heart rate just keeps rising and keeps rising and keeps rising. And this is a phenomenon known as cardiovascular drift. This is when there is a progressive increase in heart rate and a decrease in stroke volume during prolonged exercise. And this is because, remember when we spoke about the viscosity of blood, decreased plasma volume because fluid is being taken out of the blood to be able to allow you to sweat. That decreased plasma volume means blood is thicker. So the heart finds it harder to pump the blood because it's thicker. Therefore, the volume of blood pumped out of the heart per beat decreases. And what is the volume of blood pumped out of the heart per beat? That is stroke volume. So stroke volume decreases. But because cardiac output has to be maintained, the heart rate will increase to be able to compensate to make sure that cardiac output remains relatively the same. Because if you look back to this formula, which we explored in a previous video, cardiac output equals to heart rate times stroke volume. So because stroke volume is falling, heart rate has to increase if it wants to keep cardiac output relatively stable. And so that is cardiovascular drift. When you've been exercising for around 20 minutes or more, this phenomenon, cardiovascular drift, begins to happen. Lastly, before we end this video, this is a tiny but important evaluation point that you can use to really show the examiner that you know your stuff. when you're talking about altitude, right, we're spoken about how performance can drop because your aerobic capacity drops because there's less oxygen partial pressure in the air. But you could also argue that depending on the type of activity, in this case, anaerobic activity, performance can actually improve at altitude. Because at altitude, air pressure is lower, the saturation of air is lower. That means air resistance is going to be less as well. And so think of an anaerobic activity. You're trying to move very fast, right? Like if you're doing a 100-meter sprint, which is anaerobic, you're going to be slowed down by air resistance. But because air resistance is going to be smaller at higher altitudes, then in an activity like a 100-meter sprint, you would actually be able to run faster. But the downside is the recovery stage is likely to suffer when you are training at altitude. So yeah, that's it for this video. Very quick, easy topic. Once you really lock it in, I would suggest that you use our practice worksheets that we have on superponline.com to really help you ace this, master this, and smash your exams. All right, see you in the next video.